Hey there, boys and girls. It's Ralph Garman, and you're listening to Talking Codswallop. Good choice.
Hello, everybody. This is Ming Chen from AMC's Comic Book Man. You might know me from the Tell 'em Steve Dave podcast and the I Sell Comics podcast. Listen, I love podcasting. I love talking, but what I really love doing is talking Codswallop.
Hey, I'm Alicia Witt.
I'm Daniel Portman from Game of Thrones. I play Podrick Payne.
I'm Ellipses, and you're listening to the Talking... Okay, I'm Mark Bernard, and you're listening to the Talking Codswallop podcast.
Hey man, it's Kevin Smith, Silent Bob, whose voice you were never used to hearing in the 90s until I started opening it up, man. And that's because I'm a podcaster and you're listening to a podcast, Talking Codswallop, right here, man.
Hello and welcome to this week's Talking Codswallop, and on this week's episode we have a wonderful guest with us. He's a comic book writer, he's also worked on television, he's also an editor, and he is the writer behind one of my all-time favourite things, which is Transformers, and we are lucky enough this week to be joined by Simon Furman. So hello Simon.
Hi there, nice, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on. So my first question is, Simon, tell us a bit about yourself. Where does the Simon Furman story begin?
Well, I mean, I was born, back in 1961 in Sutton in Surrey, and grew up, with a voracious appetite for reading. So I was, reading books, comics, anything I could get my hands on. I grew up on a steady diet of British comics first, the humour titles, and then the boys action ones like Iron and Smash and Tiger, and then pretty quickly graduated to Marvel Comics once I discovered the Oddham's reprints of those, and then Marvel UK. So, I quickly became a very big Marvel fan. And, apart from a little gap in my teens when, there were other more important things to think about than comics, I've really been a fan all my life.
When you mentioned that you'd also been a fan all your life, what sort of comics did you gravitate to when you were younger as a child? Yeah,
I mean, like I said, I was definitely more keen on the action adventure than the humour. I loved strips like Robot Archie and the Spider and some of the I like British comics because they were often darker or they were quite villain centric, some of the strips. So there was a lot to get hold of. One of my favourite strips ran in Lion, and it was called the uncatchy title of Watch Out for the White Eyes, and it was a sort of battle, some strange gas that turned people into superhumans with white eyes. And, two plucky school kids. There were always two plucky school kids were on the ball with what was happening and trying to thwart the evil Ezra Creech. And, this really fired my imagination, and I absolutely, sort of devoured comics in those days. And then, like I say, really, once I discovered Spider-Man and, it sort of, I gravitated much more towards Marvel and those kind of comics. I kept my eye on British comics, but largely after that I was reading anything I get my hold of. I used to cycle round to, a lot of the second-hand bookstores that used to exist then, Popular Book Centre, Plus Books, these places that, as well as old sort of dog-eared paperbacks, had trays of American comics, which, were a revelation to me. The full-colour US format comic book. And really from there, I just, got hold of whatever I could. And I read a lot of the Alan Class comics, which reprinted all the sort of Atlas era, supernatural, creepy sci-fi tales. So, I was an avid comic reader back in the day.
And when you were talking about the white eye sort of comic, you're right when it's the sort of thing as a child, when it's something that has other children in it, you kind of really can sort of relate to it more, certainly as a child, and it really does grab your attention. So you obviously had the interest in sort of, reading comics, as most children sort of do. What was it you wanted to do as a child? Because I'm always interested to hear what people's initial sort of career choice was, and how maybe does it stay the same and become what they become as an adult, or does it diverge in something completely different?
Yeah, I mean, as a kid, I was fairly clueless about what I wanted to do. That almost seemed quite a way off, and when it suddenly became time to, I need a career, that almost caught me on the hop, really. And when I left school, I just went to work in a bank for a paying job. So, I was sort of behind the scenes, bod working in a bank, and, I didn't love it. And I had half-formed ideas I would like to be a journalist, but I didn't have a degree, and most journalism jobs required a degree back in the day. So it was only by sheer chance that a friend of a family friend, or a daughter of a family friend, was working for IPC magazines up in Kingsreach Tower in London, and they would often advertise jobs internally. And they saw a job advertised for a trainee journalist, on-the-job training in their competitions department, which, because IPC magazines and comics, had something like a sort of 80 to 100 titles over the month, they had a centralized department for the, win a car, win a, model kit and everything between. So, I was drafted in. My interview amounted to, show us you can compile a crossword or a word search or a something. And yeah, I had a foot in the door at IPC. And because I was the newest journalist in the department, I often got the comics division to deal with. I think the more senior members would rather be dealing with, I don't know, popular gardening, practical hi-fi, or woman's own, or whatever else. So it suited me fine, because suddenly I was going over from Lavington Street, which was where the competition department was, about a 5-minute walk over to Kingsreach Tower, up to the 20-something floor, and suddenly I'm in the offices of 2000 AD and Eagle and, Roy of the Rovers and Tiger, and it was just like, wow, I've kind of, all my childhood stuff is right here. So, it was very exciting. I got to know the editors and senior editors. So, Barry Tomlinson, Gil Page, Steve McManus, all these guys, I was just sort of going over and discussing competitions with them. And that kind of really rebooted and rekindled my interest in comics generally. And I got back into it in a big way, having gone away a bit at that point. And yeah, it was just from there, because I think I was around and about the comics division so much, eventually I was more or less headhunted for a new title they were launching called Scream.
Yeah. And who would, so when you were headhunted for that, would you say in doing that, was there anybody that you thought, right, I'm going to use their influence on the way I'm writing? Is there anybody who impacted upon you, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, certainly once I was ensconced in Scream and the editorial offices generally, I had access to scripts, which I hadn't really had before, for both for Scream, and often 2000 AD would just let me sit and read piles of John Wagner and Alan Grant dread strips, and through that I think I got the beat and flow of a comic script, more or less just sitting there reading and seeing how, John Wagner's dread scripts were very spare. He really did sort of, put words that, were unnecessary into his panel descriptions. It's pretty much Dread on bike, Dread Grimace, Dread shoots. I mean, it was really terse. And I thought, well, this is nice. I like that. I like the less is more approach. And so, I'm not saying I did it straight away, but gradually when I started writing myself, I tried to put less into panel descriptions and leave more scope for the artist to do their stuff. I think my first few scripts for Scream, which were all done more or less as a deadline thing, we didn't have a script, so I got drafted in was normally how it worked. And, I would just gradually over the time, the first few were probably overly wordy because I was just unsure myself about, I wanted to put everything in and probably, the artist just went, well, I can throw half of this out straight away.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I was the deadline crunch guy. So, very quickly there was a strip called Terror of the Cats, which, the management was just generally nervous about Scream at IPC. They feared another sort of Action Comics backlash. Like this was the video nasty era and we didn't really want to be the comic nasty. So management were very leery about sort of Scream and what we could put in it. And for whatever reason, they didn't like Terror of the Cats. Maybe they thought it was just too in the home horror, and they basically said, we need this wrapped up as soon as possible. So 2 parts in, I jumped in with part 3 of Terror and the Cats at very late notice with a mandate to wrap it up in 4 episodes. So that was my first thing. Meanwhile, I was doing some Library of Death stories, and my first one was drawn by Steve Dillon, so you can't ask for a better start than that. So I was very lucky, and Ian Rimmer, who was the editor on Scream, was a great sounding board. He was very experienced already, and was very good with his advice on what I should be doing, shouldn't be doing. And so really over the course of Scream, even though it was only 15 issues, and I probably did maybe 8 or 9 scripts, it really gave me a good sort of, grounding in comics writing, on the job training, as it were.
Well, for me, when I was a child, the person I wanted to be growing up, it sits perfectly with just what's over your shoulder, and you had major influence on that. The person I wanted to be, that unfortunately I definitely couldn't have been, was Optimus Prime.
Well, there we go. Lofty ideals. It's good.
So, in relation to that, I have to ask the question of, how did you get into the Transformers?
Well, there were a couple of hops and steps after Scream folded. Again, there was a feeling that the management kind of would be more sleep easier if Scream wasn't coming out every week. And we hit an NUJ strike, National Union of Journalists, that stopped every IPC title at the time. And so there was a gap of publication on almost everything IPC was doing. And at that point, they more or less, brought the axe down on Scream after just 15 issues. So at that point, I was kind of out of work for a while, which didn't bother me because there was a little bit of redundancy money from IPC. I'd been there by them for about 4 or 5 years. So it was fine and dandy until really I decided I did need more work. And I knew that Ian Rimmer had moved over to Marvel UK, and he knew I was on the lookout for script work and introduced me to the editor of the then quite new Transformers UK comic, who was Sheila Cranner. And she just said they're looking for UK writers to pad out the material they had. Mm-hmm. They had the American comic, but because that was monthly, that didn't provide enough material for a fortnightly or weekly comic. So they needed UK originated strip material. There was one in progress already written by Steve Parkhouse, and I was just handed a sheaf of reference and probably the 4-issue American series, and told to go away and come up with some ideas. And I presented them with one idea for a story called The Enemy Within. That was accepted, I think, gratefully, because I don't think Sheila had many other sort of writers on the job at the time. And I think Steve was only ever sort of in for a one-off. So, very quickly I became her sort of go-to writer for Transformers. And, at the time, of course, I treated it like any other job, fully expecting it would be for a very limited time, that there may be many other writers involved, and, that it would probably, like a lot of those licensed titles, last about a year or something if we were lucky.
And boy, oh boy, did it last longer than a year. But it's, I have to also, I want to just say one huge thank you of something that came from Transformers when I was younger. And I was probably, 5 or 6, maybe a little bit older. My godmother bought me the Transformers annual. And in that, there was a story called Victory, which you wrote. And you hold the key to be one of the first people who introduced me to Shakespeare, because you used an example of Shakespeare with the character of Starscream, and he's holding Megatron's half of his body, anyway, certainly his head, and says, "Alas, poor Megatron, I knew him well." And that's still in my...
And that, in turn, is really being kind of weaned on a diet of Stan Lee, who was always dropping in Shakespeare and mythology and kind of words I'd never heard of in a comic book, and felt constrained then to look up, and it was really that kind of thing that I brought to my writing. I didn't want to write down to kids. I just wanted to write the kind of stories I wanted to write, and assume some kind of degree of they'd either get it or they'd get the sense of it or they'd ask about it. And it seemed to go down well with the readers of Transformers, who maybe were used to, a slightly younger approach to their comics than we gave them in Transformers.
No, I mean, I'd say that's certainly something at the time I would look at some of the American Transformers comics against the writing you did, and it was just a much more, I mean, you never, the beauty of it is when you reassess it as an adult as well, it's even more evident, you never spoke down to the reader. You always, gave them something to elevate the thinking to, compared to sort of some of the comics you'd see where it was almost felt like it'd been dumbed down a bit. And that's something that I'm certainly grateful for as somebody who read them, that it educated you. As I said, you showed me an idea of Shakespeare when I was very young.
I mean, we also, we were quite experimental with our story structure often. We just assumed our readers would be okay with flashbacks, jump forwards, backwards, time travel, sort of different perspectives on the same sort of bits of story. And generally, I think, everybody responded well to that.
They certainly, they definitely did, and I can definitely say I did. When you have to, because I'm always curious, because when a writer is like yourself is putting something together, how do you do it? How do you get the creative juices sort of flowing?
Yeah, I'm fairly a start with what used to be a blank bit of paper and is now a blank, sort of Word document on your page. And, I mean, I always, before I ever go to script, I do my storylines and outlines, and, I develop a story in stages from a kind of, a bullet pitch, where it's just a few, this happens, that happens, then into a kind of tighter outline, and only then do I really go to, start scripting. But each of that is probably always done, without a lot. I know a lot of writers do a lot of, thinking first, or, notes, in longhand, but I just tend to jump right in and, look at that. I've always started with characters. So, right from those very first stacks of Transformers reference material that Sheila handed me, I just looked at all the, really in-depth character biographies that Bob Budiansky had done for the characters and thought, well, there's a character that would be good mixed with that character. And, what's the worst situation you could put a character with a fear of water in, and from those sort of basics, I used to sort of build the spine of a story, at least, and I've always tended to go character first and large MacGuffin, sort of big idea second.
Prior to getting into I'm sort of going a bit backward to this question, but prior to getting into the Transformers comic and working on it, did you have any knowledge of them as a product? No.
None at all. And this was very early on in things. I don't know whether the cartoon show was on TV. Certainly the American comic, the first issue may have come out, or first issues, but it was very, very early doors. And because I was, I suppose, at the time, in my early 20s, I wasn't really paying attention to Saturday morning cartoons either. So even if it had been on, even if there were adverts for the toys, I doubt I'd seen them. Now, I'm pretty sure that when I walked into the office, it was just like, okay, Transformers, whatever that is. I'm hungry for work, give me it. And the rest really is a whole career based on that, that moment.
And moving forward in your career, you've also worked on other Marvel publications, other characters, and you worked on established characters. So I'm always curious to know: did you find that a lot of constraints were put on you, or were you able to just? It's like, here's the characters. Go forth and write what you wish with them. Or is it like you must stick to very specific things? This character, so say it was Peter Parker, this character cannot do this, or this. Or when you did work on Terminator 2, for example, you cannot have this character doing this, or this.
Yeah, I think you're always aware of the history. I was a big Marvel fan, so, I understood the world and the Marvel universe and the way it worked. But I don't remember constraints as such. I just think probably they were more self-imposed. An editor's not going to go for something that dramatically changes the status quo as first story pitch to them. First, generally, and certainly it was the way with Marvel, US, you've got to prove you can do the nuts and bolts. This is the character. This is the essence of the character. Tell us a one-shot, a self-contained story. And so a lot of the stuff pitched to Marvel was very much in that vein, except, strangely, I came in slightly from another direction because I was doing Transformers, the US comic for them, and things like Robocop and other things. And it was only gradually when I started to pick up things like, I did some She-Hulk and What Ifs, and Alpha Flight. And, What Ifs were good because you could just throw all the cards up in the air with What If and do those stories that otherwise no editor would approve. So What If was great fun, and you were able to dip into the Marvel history, which I loved and knew, and just spin off new stories from big or little incidents. So yeah, generally it was an easy way in, and by the time I was writing Alpha Flight, I don't think Alpha Flight was a big enough Marvel book to be too much on the radio. If I'd been writing X-Men or Wolverine, it would have been a different story. But Alpha Flight, we largely just went our own merry way with it, and apart from a few crossovers with Infinity this or Infinity that during my run, we weren't really dictated to in terms of what we could or couldn't do. And so in some ways, I don't think I really, had any kind of, head banging against the wall. Generally, my time certainly in those kind of early mid 90s was very easy with them. And, for many ways, to me, the kind of ultimate realization of everything I want for Marvel, which I'd read as a kid.
Brilliant. And it's an interesting thing just to say when you were talking about What If, because one of the What Ifs I really loved reading actually comes from a character you created, which was Death's Head, who as a child I was absolutely because for me, when I first learned about Death's Head as a child, it's when he was in the Transformers comics and you'd crossed him over, and still in my head I can see the work that it would have been Jeff Senior, I think, who had done the comic cover where there's Rodimus Prime is being hunted by Cyclonus and Scourge, and Death's Head's brought into the mix as a bounty hunter to do that. I mean, Death's Head is, as an adult, I just find him amazing. Even now, still, I think he's a fabulous character he created. So, how did he come about?
Yeah, he was a bit of a happy accident, really. The Transformers story I was doing was more or less a sort of riff on spaghetti westerns. It was, set up in that way. I mean, obviously the mechanics are still giant robots and world-conquering plans and whatever else, but the fundamentals were meant to be a spaghetti western. And, to me, a huge ingredient of that is a bounty hunter character. So, I just set out, as we didn't really have a Transformer that fitted that bill. They were very much Autobot or Decepticon. There were a few minor characters that possibly could have used, but none of them really quite worked. And so we just thought, well, we'll invent a bounty hunter, disposable, in at the beginning of the story, out at the end, probably destroyed. So, Death's Head, I just sketched out an idea on, in words for Jeff, as it turned out. I don't think we intended Jeff to draw that episode. Often it was just who was available at a given time. And Jeff just turned in this, brilliant design for Death's Head. I mean, a lot of things were there, the interchangeable weapons, they were all in the script. But Jeff's visualization just meant all of us kind of, maybe this could be more. And so in one of those very, very rare occasions, I went back into my script once I saw the artwork and started adding, I suppose, more colour to him in terms of his personality, the verbal tics, the added layers that sort of became his character. And by the end of the story, we just knew, we couldn't just let him go. So at that point, slightly retroactively, we need to create him as a Marvel character. Otherwise, we can't use him anymore, really. So at that point, we did a quick one-page story called High Noon Tex, which, quickly was dropped in as a kind of house ad strip into all sorts of Marvel titles. And, in the meantime, in the background, the copyright, stuff was going through the works. And just gradually, he became a Marvel character, and we knew we had to, even though we loved using him, Transformers, move him out of Transformers into his own title, ultimately.
Mm-hmm. And I do remember the High Noon Tex as being the little piece just introducing him. But I also love the fact with Death's Head that you crossed him into all different things as well. So it wasn't like he just stayed... he got his own story, his own comic book, but also the fact that, he crossed him into things sometimes like Doctor Who, that he was involved in that you had him doing the crossover. It was the crossover things where he got involved with, the more established Marvel characters, like Iron Man. And I just loved that. So, looking over it, and it just showed what a brilliant character he created, because he could put him into all these different scenarios with different characters, and he worked. Yeah. Brilliantly.
I mean, he's one of those characters who technically has no redeeming features. You're supposed to be able to find some kind of empathy or, for the main character, but he doesn't. He's such a sort of constant. It made for some interesting storytelling, and it just meant that guest stars seemed to work very well with him, because he just is. So then you've just got the interest of how the Doctor or Iron Man of 2020 or the Fantastic Four react to him. He stays the same, and they sort of bounce around him. And I think that was the appeal of the character to us, and also to other creators who used him, like Walt Simonson, who then did a couple of covers for us, and then dropped him into Fantastic Four during his run on the book. So, it was a happy accident, like I said. I think over the years we sort of refined him into a lasting character and one that is still in Marvel Comics today, which is very gratifying to see.
I mean, he is. He's absolutely a brilliant creation, and he's, as you said, he's one that always, I always like to see what can be done with him. And as you said, it's how could I best put it to make in relation to what you said for myself. You put him into a situation, and as you said, the people around him deal with him. He just ploughs his own.
That's the idea, and I think that's the thing that you've got to remember about Death's Head is there are no real sort of shades of grey with him. He does the things his way, and it's always the same. But yes, circumstances and the other characters dictate how a story goes. There's no, the big thing in Marvel, when we were having our kind of lectures on what a Marvel comic book is, revolved around conflict, that a character must face some kind of conflict in a given 22 pages or whatever. They must have to make a big decision, a moral decision, an emotional decision. But with Death's Head, that doesn't really apply. He may pay lip service to it or be confronted by issues such as that, but he just doesn't. And so in many ways, he was almost that kind of British style of Marvel character. The Brits at the time, certainly in the 80s, had that kind of reputation for bringing a slightly sort of different worldview to superheroes and the established Marvel or DC characters. And I think the Death's Head comes out of that. He's more kind of 2000 AD than Marvel, really. He's got few, if any, redeeming features, but you kind of love him.
You could definitely see him, or it'd be very interesting to see him going toe-to-toe with someone like Dredd. See.
Dredd's a good example. Dredd is very unbending, unchanging, and he just is the law, and that's about the end of it. There may be some wobbles, but generally he steers, again, like Death's Head, a very sort of direct, straight path.
You mentioned about something that I found interesting. It was almost like happy coincidence that Jeff did the artwork for that one. How much say did you get, or do you get, on the people who you work with, who were working around with to produce things? And obviously that will probably change as an editor. So both as a writer and editor, what's the...
Yeah, I mean, on Transformers, like I say, it was very much predicated by who was available. We had a weekly schedule. The luxury of having an artist do 4 parts of a story were rare, in a row. So we had to chop and change. Sometimes there were ones, like when we did Target 2006, there was a specific part of that we all thought was Jeff Senior's, just because he did kinetic, exciting action almost better than almost any of the other artists we had at the time. But no, often during those days there was no choosing. But when latterly I was able to pick an artist, so when it came to do Dragon's Claws, everybody wanted Jeff to do it. I don't think there was anybody else in the running for it. He was the guy we wanted to launch this, US format line of Marvel UK comics with. But now, still I work with Jeff, whenever I can. But yeah, I mean, I suppose it depends. These days you do tend to kind of team up with an artist a lot more than you used to. But, still often I write things and I write them not knowing who they're going to be drawn by.
I just, when you mentioned Target 2006, I always have a lovely memory of that from when I was younger, which was I was going on holiday with my parents to Germany, which is where some of my family is from. And I can only assume my parents were like, how do we keep this child quiet on the plane for... So they buy me Transformers comic, and it was the Target 2006, and by God, that's I take my hat off to both you and Jeff, because that's one hell of a read, and it's a read that you can go back to again and again even now. It's just been a very nice layered thing to read, and even though you have, or I had obviously the knowledge of the comic, the toy line, and seeing the cartoons, it's what else you did with that made it, interesting, really stick in a person's mind. It was interesting when you said about it being a week, you get the people together and it's a weekly product. Did you ever have times where things would go wrong? Maybe and you're like, oh God, I've got to get it ready.
We certainly had deadline crunches, but we, obviously we had a breather whenever there was US reprint material, so we could, start to do stories ahead, get artwork in. But yeah, we had a few sort of crunches that, I seem to remember one episode that Dan Reed was drawing was very late, and he was living in France and had to bring the artwork physically over to get, literally to make the deadline. And I think the last episode of Legacy of Unicron was more or less drawn in-house by Brian Hitch and Jeff Senior, because again we were up against it, and each page as it was finished was straight off to be lettered, coloured, and and then colour separated, as was the way it was then. So yeah, it was fairly hand to mouth sometimes, but often we tried, just like I say, to build up, while we were on reprint, a stash of originated strips.
When it came to looking at something like Target 2006, which has a level of influence from the film, did you at the time get a chance to see the film, or was that something that you would not? Because I know it probably wouldn't have been something that would have been maybe your exact area of interest to watch. You sound like you didn't see the cartoon and things.
No, we saw the film, but we saw the film after we did Target 2006 from a draft of the script we had. Mm-hmm. That was pretty much it, plus obviously who the characters were. But, Target 2006 was done way ahead of the movie actually was. But, did we go and see it? Yeah, we did, and I loved it. And, I think it was my first, or a lot of our first exposure to that kind of Japanese anime style of cartoon. And so, we were blown away, and it very much became the inspiration for many stories that followed on from Target 2006.
Brilliant. And you are certainly, when you look at it as a child, you see it differently to when you look at it as an adult, because you see themes in it. You're thinking, wow, this is quite an advanced thing for a child to watch. I know certainly you always hear people of around my age, saying it's probably one of the most traumatic things they most ever saw, because all these cats are just getting blown away.
I know, it was fairly brutal, when you look back at it now. But again, we were sure this is really what kids wanted to read. And, because they were robots, we had that much more latitude for that kind of somewhat more extreme action, violence, whatever. I think if these had been human beings, we would have had to neuter it a lot. But robots, well, they get their heads knocked off. It's not the biggest deal in the world. So we were lucky in that respect that, we were allowed. And also, I think we were lucky that Hasbro UK seemed quite happy with everything we were doing, and, never said, do you maybe want to tone this down a bit? So, yeah, we were genuinely lucky. I think, we just assume our kids are kind of a little more resilient here in the UK, or did back then.
Well, I think the film probably had worked on making a lot of children more resilient after they'd seen it. Looking across, and it's a bit of a difficult one to ask this, but looking across all the things you've worked on, which I know is like a hell of a question to ask, do you have a favourite character that you've written for? And do you have a favourite character you've either killed off or resurrected?
I think Death's Head will always be, because I co-created him with Jeff, I always feel very paternal about the character, and, he would be right up there with the characters that I think I've made a mark with and whatever. So, Death's Head, definitely. But, I've enjoyed more or less everything from the sort of the obscure to the sort of main characters I've written. And, often with Transformers, I found that the most interesting ones were the minor characters that you could build into something they maybe weren't in their other appearances or in their little biography things that came with them. So, I think, there's probably a few, and killed off characters. I think I've killed off a lot of characters. I was kind of in Transformers for wholesale wiping out characters. But, I've obviously enjoyed writing Grimlock in Transformers. He will always be a favourite of mine. And, every time I've got to, tackle a Spider-Man or a Wolverine, it's a big kick for me, just because, again, they were such formative characters for me. And, recently, with doing The Vigilant for Rebellion, again, it was going back to the characters I'd read even before Marvel, and getting to play around in that world as well as a writer. So that was very gratifying.
Excellent. And I did like the fact that you wrote Grimlock to have intelligence, as opposed to this way he was originally sort of portrayed as being, well, for want of a better word, stupid. But you actually gave him depth.
He just wasn't very interesting to me as a dumb character,
No.
And very early on, we had the Dinobots. We knew they were disappeared out of the US strip for the foreseeable future. So we had them as the spine of our UK stories, which wouldn't impact too much on what the US stories were doing. So I think that was part of the reason that the Dinobots just had to be more interesting than they were in the cartoon show, or even maybe in the Marvel US comic.
Mm. No, it was just a brilliant way of doing it, and certainly giving them, well, you gave them their own sort of life, so to speak, compared to just like the tag-on characters they'd maybe been originally portrayed as, shall we say. We met at a convention in 2019, I think it was, in London. What has your general experience of conventions been?
Yeah, generally very good. We live, we work in isolation, and certainly back in the day, you very rarely had interaction with actual readers. Readers' letters was about the limit of it. Very occasionally, I remember doing some store signings. Certainly when we launched Death's Head and Dragon's Claws, we did a little tour of the comic shops, such as they were back then. And often Nostalgia and Comics in Birmingham was very big on having signings and stuff. But generally, we didn't have that much feedback from live fans, as it were. So I really like the conventions. I like meeting people. I like chatting. I like, just getting feedback from people on, what they think of the stories, what works, what doesn't. So, yeah, generally, yes, you can have, sometimes, probably not just in comics, the fans can be, a little sort of full on or intense, or, sometimes opinionated about your stories, and, not always in a good way. But, that's the sort of the the smaller portion of conventions and signings. And generally, yeah, especially the Transformers ones, which, again, the fans can be very passionate and very divided about, comic or cartoon, toys or comic or, but generally, you just get that these people love, the product, the whole thing and what you're doing, hopefully. And yeah, it's good to get live, sort of response to what you're doing.
Where you'll hear the millionth time the sort of thing I would say to you, which is, you were my childhood.
But, generally, and especially as I've got, older, I just generally feel old when people in their 40s come up and say, oh, yeah, I was 5 when I was reading your stuff, which does make me feel very old. But, but no, it's all good. And, generally, I say everyone behaves themselves and it's just generally a good experience. And like I say, I've become very fond of the Transformers conventions, which can be, very social and sociable, outside of the convention itself, just in terms of, a drink afterwards in the bar or whatever. So, I really like the convention experience and just getting out there, really.
Well, I can say this, and I mean this sincerely. You don't look old, so don't worry about that at all. You mentioned Transformers conventions, because I think when we met, it was at a London convention, like a film and comic convention. What was BotCon like? Because I never was able to attend one.
Yeah, BotCon was great. I mean, the American convention was, an eye-opener at the time for myself and Andrew Wildman when we went over to our first. We had no idea there was a Transformers fandom still, or if there, I don't know whether we knew there was one that had endured, but there it was. And, hundreds of people turning up and voice actors and other guests from the toy company. And we were, we were wowed by it. And I loved BotCon and, whatever it became afterwards, TFCC or something like that. But, I mean, yeah, it's always been very good. And, you just meet interesting people. And, we got to meet so many of the voice actors and, Vince DiCola and Stan Bush, who'd done the music for Transformers, the movie. Mm-hmm. And just all these great people who've become, over the years, friends through sort of repeat meetings at these conventions. And, just generally, they're just such a nice bunch of people.
Now, I have to ask if this has ever happened, because you go in something like BotCon, which is the big Transformers stuff. Has anyone ever asked you to sign a body part to get a tattoo?
People have presented limbs, let's put it that way, to get sort of signatures on, but it's really not the easiest thing in the world anyway, and presumably somebody has to wash at a certain point. So no, generally that's low to no, thankfully.
Yeah, because I've heard of people where they're like, sign my leg, sign my arm, whatever. Yeah, and then they get it tattooed.
It has happened.
Yeah. But, well, it shows the love for your work, and that cannot be a bad thing. I wanted to ask the question on this. It's one I have been curious about. How did you writing as Chris Francis come about? What was the story behind that?
Christopher and Francis are my middle names, and if I needed a pseudonym, that was what I used. And generally I used it because there was a general frowning in Marvel about editors writing for their own book. So
right.
There should be a division between an editor and the writer on a title. But on the odd occasion where I was in charge of, say, a Transformers annual and the scripts, often Richard Starkings used to, edit my scripts and be that kind of editor, fill that kind of editor role when I was writing and editing. But occasionally it didn't. And if it required an editorial credit, I just used to drop Chris Francis in there, so it didn't look quite so me through the whole sort of book or whatever.
Yeah, I like it. Good thinking. It's a good way of doing it, actually. So you've done all this brilliant writing. You've been an editor, but you were also in the Guinness Book of Records, which was in 2011, I think, if my memory serves me, where you were in for, this is me having to go off my memory, was it most contributions to a comic book and the fastest production of a comic book? Is that?
I don't know. I mean, we were all involved in this at one of Mark Miller's conventions. They did do a comic book in 1 day or something like that, and I was just one of the writers who pitched into that. It was one of his Kapow conventions in London. He did 2 or 3 of those, and yes, one of them was to do this record-breaking turnaround of a comic book. So I just scripted a few of the pages from Mark's outline, along with many other writers and artists. And yeah, the whole thing happened over a, I think, 24-hour period, the actual production of this comic book.
And was it a very stressful experience, or was it something that wasn't too bad to do?
I mean, sometimes a little bit of deadline stress helps in terms of, the creativity and getting it done. So no, I did my bit fairly quickly and got out of there.
So you've got fond memories of it. That's the main thing.
Yeah, no, it was good fun, good thing to be involved in.
Good. Because all I kept thinking is for the sort of time constraints, would it be one of these things for you just like?
I mean, we had the spine of the story anyway, so it was only a matter of breaking it up into some panels and adding some speech balloons and captions. So it wasn't the biggest ask in the world.
Good. So I think we met. Going off my memory, it would have been 2019 when we met, around that time. And you were basically, I mean, you and Jeff did something that's phenomenal, which is you created your own company, which is the Forged by Fire Productions, and it was for writing your own comic book. What was the process behind doing that, and how difficult was it?
Yeah, I mean, it was difficult. We very much wanted to do something self-published that was ours, that, was very much, what we wanted to do rather than what somebody else thought was, going to sell or whatever. So, we sat down, when we had some time and just dreamed up the scenario for To the Death, which is sort of based on a little bit on in broad strokes, Dragon's Claws. It's got a little bit of that vibe to it. And, there's a lot of our other kind of greatest hits rolled into To the Death. But we just really wanted to be able to tell a story that, was ours completely and rolled out at its own pace. And it filled however long it filled, the story. We looked at it like, well, this is a movie, so it's as long as it is. And I wrote it almost like a screenplay originally. Jeff drew it all in sort of single, sort of rectangular frames. And originally we published it online. So it was published digitally first. And then we broke it down later into a 10-issue kind of prestige format maxi series. And so, yeah, it ended up quite a lot of pages in the end, something like 450 odd pages. But, very good to do and good to have something that, out of that we spawned another character called Killer Toa, who we're doing some stuff with in Shift and in other places. So, yeah, it was just good to do something that was ours, that we controlled, that, would rise or fall on our own efforts, rather than somebody else's. And yeah, overall brilliant experience, but hard work, and even harder work because we were self-publishing to get it into the places like comic stores sell it for us. So, you know, it was great, but very hard work, and, you know, kind of hard to, you know, make a living out. You're putting so much of your time into that up front.
Mm-hmm. And what would sorry.
No, but overall, you know, we're really pleased with the end product, and the fact that, you know, we got to, you know, 10 issues, and, you know, they're now in nice sort of slipcases. So, you know, it just looks, you know, like a good body of work.
Well, I really enjoyed it, and it's a really, really good, enjoyable read. So if you were to give advice to anyone who wanted to start their own to do something of that sort, what would you say?
I would say maybe think a little smaller than we did. You know, it was great to do this massive thing, but somewhat unwieldy in terms of, you know, when you come to bring it out. You know, I think if we did it again, Jeff and I, we would do a more contained 1 or 2 issues or something, or, you know, do it, you know, sort of crowd-funded in some way, because, you know, you spend so much time on the logistics. Sometimes you lose the time on that you would put into the creativity, because there's so much else to deal with on it. So I think we might just do it on a smaller scale next time, and, you know, maybe sort of fund it first and then publish, which, you know, would probably make, you know, do wonders for our sanity overall.
Well, I think definitely. I mean, if you were to put it up for crowdfunding, trust me, I'd be one of the first people to try and get something in there for it. I can definitely say that with certainty. I think you'd find a huge positive response from the fan base, actually, to do something like that. Certainly, like crowdfunding of things, it's the thing that people feel the ownership, not ownership, but they feel involvement, don't they? And what a bit, you know, that feeling of involvement in what somebody's done. So yeah, I think that could be certainly. I couldn't fund the whole thing, but I definitely put some money down. Yes. I'm going to ask one question I would like to know is, what do you enjoy reading?
Well, I mean, you know, reading, I mean, I read books, I read other comics, but, you know, fiction-wise, I tend to not read an awful lot of sci-fi, strangely. You know, I'm much more a kind of hard-boiled crime reader, you know, Private Eyes, kind of noir stuff. You know, I've just finished reading Robbie Morrison's book, Edge of the Grave, which is a crime novel set in 1930s Glasgow. Brilliant, you know, perfectly up my street in terms of, you know, that sort of gritty, hard-edged crime thriller that I like. You know, but I read a lot of, you know, I'm a big fan of the Lee Child Reacher books.
Yeah.
I read a lot of Stephen King, you know, and just generally, I'm always reading. And comics-wise, you know, I still, as much as possible, keep abreast of what's happening in, you know, sort of Marvel and the independent scene. You know, I've recently been reading Gideon Falls, which I really, really enjoyed. You know, so, you know, I try as much as time permits to kind of keep up with my comic reading, but I, like most people, I think I have a kind of growing pile of things that I've bought and haven't yet got around to reading.
Unfortunately, that's a feeling I know all too well. When you mentioned Stephen King out of interest, what's your favourite Stephen King novel?
That's a good question. I mean, I think some of the, you know, probably, you know, going back, I would say sort of Salem's Lot and some of those, you know, sort of early ones like The Shining and, you know, ones like, you know, I really liked Christine and Cujo and some of those ones that maybe less, but, you know, I loved the Bachman books. I always thought were really good. Yeah. His Bachman ones, they were sometimes leaner and meaner than his own, you know, sort of self-pen name ones. So, you know, I really enjoyed, you know, I think The Running Man is a brilliant book. You know, not such a good film, but the book was brilliant and brilliantly structured in as much as the chapters count down from high to low and get progressively shorter as you go through the book, which almost subliminally creates a pace as you read it. Very, very clever. And, I think I admire things like that.
Because just when you said Running Man, because obviously for a lot of people, their first, exposure to Running Man would have been the film. So the first knowledge I ever had of it was the film. But when I read the book, because it's markedly different, I was like, wow, if they actually, and there were rumours they're looking to do it as a film, more loyal to what the book was, I think that could be really interesting to see. And looking at King, I also, on his work, really like Thinner.
Yes, Thinner's very good.
And that was another one where it's a very interesting adaptation of it. But Thinner as a read is one that I can go back to quite a lot.
I've liked a few others. Mr. Mercedes is very good. Cell, very good. And I enjoyed. What's the one they adapted recently?
It?
No. Cracky.
Dark Tower?
Sorry?
Dark Tower, maybe?
No. It was the character from Mr. Mercedes is sort of kind of rolls on into it. It was about an 8 part. Anyway, it will come back to me, but that was it.
It's that sort of stuff, and it's always interesting just to see what people who work as writers, what sort of things they also like to look at doing. And a question I always like to also ask people is, what sort of music are you into?
Yeah, given my age, when I was really into music, it was very much the late 70s, early 80s. And so I was kind of, I suppose, punk and new wave and two-tone were the things that fired me once, I was of an age that I appreciated music. But latterly I've become much broader in my tastes, and I like a lot of blues music and that kind of especially that kind of really raw sort of what they call back porch blues, which is just like his guitar kind of thing. So all sorts, and I'm become a lot broader, I think, in my musical tastes as I've got older, and less of a just if it's more than sort of 3 energetic minutes I'm bored. I'm more forgiving now and just exploring and finding new things. I've recently got very into the Velvet Underground, which I'd never really listened to as a younger person. Really appreciate now.
And on a musical front, what would you say the best gig you've ever been to is?
Oh, that's hard. I used to, again, a lot of the gigs I went to were that new wave era of gigs, but possibly the two standouts for me are I saw Bruce Springsteen at Wembley Stadium, and that was utterly incredible. Around the time of kind of Born in the USA time, and utterly amazing concert that was. And on a smaller scale, I once saw the Undertones at Hammersmith Palais, and that was an amazing gig where they literally ran out of songs. They had no more songs. And, everyone's cheering for them to do more. And they just said, well, as long as you don't mind us doing the same ones over again. And it was just a brilliant gig.
Because, for me, the best gig I've been to that, will always stick in the memories. I've seen Paul McCartney twice, and that is something I saw my dad. So there's obviously the link of seeing that with my dad, but also just whether you like him or not, it's a Beatle, it's Paul McCartney. It was amazing. It's the best I've ever been to. On a smaller scale, of one of the best gigs I ever went to is, do you ever remember, or do you know who Neil Innes was?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So the Bonzo Do Doodah band, well, we saw him when it was the Ruttles.
Yes.
And I actually interviewed him just before that concert, which unfortunately, since he passed, my interview with him was probably one of the last interviews he ever did.
Wow.
But that was phenomenal to see. Just an amazing thing. And you were only in a small, venue to see it, but it absolutely just...
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes the smaller ones are the better ones.
Yeah, he blew the socks off, and I've actually made some, good friends with, well, I was friendly with him, but also people he worked with that I got to know through that, which is nice. You made some lifelong friends from that. But yeah, you do see some interesting stuff. I would also just love to ask the question of, what are you working on now? What's the plans for 2021 and beyond, Simon?
I'm working on a few things. Recent stuff has been things like Transformers 84 for IDW and The Vigilant for Rebellion.
Before I forget, can I just say thank you for that? Transformers 84, because that was, wow. Yeah, that was a really good.
That was real fun to do. And, I'm hopeful IDW will want to do some more in that, vein as we roll forwards. But, mostly at the moment, I'm working on some other stuff for Rebellion, which is very nice. I'm very enjoying being part of their kind of reinvention of all these classic British heroes. I am working on a couple of games at the moment. Games actually is strangely a large chunk of my work at the moment. And, a few other bits and pieces that I can't kind of talk about because they're still too early to announce. But strangely, games is filling a lot of my time, and because they're so kind of long term, obviously Transformers Earth Wars is just something I keep contributing to on a basis. But there's some other stuff I'm working on now that probably won't come out for a year, 2 years or something. So it's a strange way, but I'm really enjoying it. It's very collaborative and very team led. So that's
brilliant.
Been great fun to do, and keep plugging away at sort of some new Killer Toa and hopefully some more to the Death stuff. So lots going on at the moment.
Good, very good. And obviously, we've all been living under the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. As you and I discussed earlier, I unfortunately have long COVID, so I can, recognise there's been an impact there. What sort of impact has it had on you? And do you think that it might have any sort of impact on your future work? Is it a theme you could maybe work into something?
Well, maybe. I don't know. Will it impact on something I do? I don't know. Personally, it hasn't affected me much. Obviously, the same restrictions that have applied to everyone, really. But, it hasn't impacted in as much as I work from home anyway. So, that's what I've continued doing. Initially, may have dropped off a bit, but very quickly that kind of bounced back. So, strangely, it's been a fairly negligible impact, and thankfully health-wise and sanity-wise, I hope I'm doing okay. So, no, strangely, it hasn't impacted that much. And, I think it's a funny thing. I'm sure people who write, contemporary novels will have to deal with it, but in what I write, probably not. It probably will be something that, unless I do it allegorically and, something in a story that, is COVID by another name, but I can't see that it is going to hit anything I'm currently working on.
Well, maybe one for the future, who knows? So I always like to ask people when I'm interviewing them, if you could produce anything, or you could make anything, any sort of storyline, anything like that sort, what would you do?
I dabble a bit in film writing. I work with another writer, Mark Salisbury, who's a film journalist, and we put together some scripts, and often where we tend to end up is squarely in the horror genre. That seems to sort of suit us. So I guess, I would make one of these horror movie scripts. So, we've had little sniffs of interest or whatever, but I would just love to see something we've written make the cinema screen. I think that would do me, whatever the film product is, be lovely to actually get something on the big screen as opposed to the small screen.
Well, I think that's probably the best place we could sort of end our conversation. I think that would be brilliant if you could get something on the big screen. And as I said earlier about the comic front, if you ever need a big crowdfunding, I will happily contribute something, most happily.
We shall definitely, look in that direction in the next year or so, I think. Okay,
well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me, Simon, and I wish you continued health and happiness with the future.
No, pleasure, and I wish you better from your long COVID as soon as possible.
Thank you very much.